Hello listener, tonight we will gently drift through the long and fascinating journey of the Middle Ages of time of kings and castles, monks and manuscripts, slow change and quiet resilience. Before you get fully comfortable, take just a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy calm, thoughtful storytelling like this, and feel free to leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always so interesting to see where in the world people are joining from to fall asleep to history.now. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and let's begin. Our story doesn't start with war or glory, but with a quiet ending. The year is 476 CE. The Western Roman Empire, once mighty and sprawling, finally collapses. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulosa, child, has been quietly removed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. No dramatic final battle, no fiery last stand, just a soft close to a chapter already crumbling from within. In the east, the Roman world lives on as Byzantium, but in the west, a silence begins. Roman cities shrink, trade routes grow quiet. The old infrastructure, Odie's aqueducts, institutions begins to fade. In their place, smaller kingdoms rise. Warlords, tribal chiefs, and former Roman officials grasp for control in a world without central authority. Germanic tribes move in, Goths, Vandals, Lombards. The map becomes a patchwork of shifting borders and forgotten provinces, but life continues. In fields and villages, people still plant, harvest, and pray. Bishops become local leaders. Roman villas transform into manorial estates. Latin twists into early Romance languages. The seeds of a new world are quietly sown. In Gaul, a Frankish leader named Clovis begins building what will one day be France. His conversion to Christianity binds him to the powerful church in Rome. Across the sea, Anglo-Saxons settle in Britain, forming their own kingdoms. And in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian dreams of reuniting the empire. So begins what we call the Middle Ages, not a dark age, not a fall into nothingness, but a long, slow transformation from empire to something new. Let your thoughts wander now through this ancient time and drift into rest as the echoes of the past soften around you. Asterisk. In the centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the European continent transformed into a patchwork of emerging kingdoms and lingering traditions. The Roman world did not vanish overnight. Rather, it faded gradually, leaving behind its roads, laws, and customs, to be absorbed and reshaped by the peoples who settled into its shadow. Among these were the Franks, a Germanic people who would rise to prominence in the former province of Gaul. The Frankish king Clovis, ruling from the late 5th century, proved to be a figure of great consequence. His conversion to Christianity, specifically the Roman form, not the Arian Christianity, favored by other Germanic rulers, was a turning point. With his baptism, he forged an alliance between the Frankish throne and the Catholic Church, one that would shape the character of Western Europe for generations to come. Clovis's dynasty, the Merovingians, ruled a loosely organized kingdom, marked by shifting loyalties, regional warlords, and a reliance on the personal bonds of loyalty that would come to define feudalism. Authority in the Frankish lands, as in much of Europe, was not centralized. Instead, it was personal, based on the loyalty of nobles and the oaths of vassals. This decentralization would become one of the most characteristic features of the medieval period. To the south, the Visigoths held sway in the Iberian Peninsula, establishing a kingdom centered around Toledo. Their rule, too, was marked by a complex relationship between Roman institutions and Germanic leadership. Like the Franks, they gradually adopted the Latin language and many Roman customs, though their Arian beliefs would eventually give way to Catholicism. In the Italian peninsula, the Ostrogoths ruled from Ravenna. Their leader, Theodoric the Great, sought to preserve Roman traditions and administration while maintaining Gothic military supremacy. His reign is remembered as a period of relative stability and cultural continuity, though after his death, the region would become embroiled in conflict with the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Further east, the Byzantine Empire remained strong, a beacon of Roman continuity amidst the fragmentation of the West. Under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the Byzantines launched ambitious campaigns to reclaim former Roman territories. including North Africa and parts of Italy. Justinian also undertook the codification of Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental legal work that would influence legal thought for centuries to come. Justinian's reign, however, was also marked by plague, war, and religious conflict. His efforts to reunify the empire strained the state's resources, and his campaigns ultimately failed to re-establish lasting control over the West. Nonetheless, the cultural and legal legacy of Byzantium would continue to shape both the Eastern Mediterranean and, indirectly, the West. Meanwhile, in the British Isles, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were taking form. Following the Roman withdrawal, waves of settlers from what is now Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes established themselves in England. These groups displaced or absorbed the native Britons, pushing them into the Western Highlands and Wales. Over time, distinct kingdoms such as Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria emerged, each ruled by its own line of kings. These early medieval societies were largely rural and agrarian. The great cities of the Roman world had declined, and with them much of the infrastructure of trade, governance, and culture. But even amid this decline, the Christian Church remained a stabilizing force. Monasteries, in particular, preserved literacy and learning. Monks copied ancient texts, cultivated land, and provided spiritual guidance to surrounding communities. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, established a model of monastic life based on prayer, labor, and study, one that would spread across the continent. By the close of the 7th century, a new world was slowly forming, built not on the grandeur of empire, but on the intimate structures of kinship, loyalty, and faith. A world of manor houses and monasteries, of oral traditions and handwritten scrolls, of wandering missionaries and tribal kings. All across Europe, the seeds of medieval society were taking root. Though still fragile, still in flux, they would grow into the complex network of kingdoms, cultures, and institutions that defined the Middle Ages. As the 8th century unfolded, one dynasty would rise above the others to leave a profound mark on medieval Europe: the Carolingians. Emerging from the declining Merovingian line, this new family of rulers brought renewed stability, territorial expansion, and a cultural revival to the Frankish realms. The Carolingian ascent began with Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace, who wielded true power behind the Merovingian throne. He is best remembered for his victory at the Battle of Tours in 732, where he repelled an advancing Muslim army from Al-Andalus, halting their northward expansion into Frankish territory, though later romanticized as a decisive turning point for Christendom. The battle's true significance lies in Charles's consolidation of military authority, which laid the groundwork for his family's eventual kingship. Charles's son Pepin the Short formally ended Merovingian rule by seeking the Pope's blessing to become king. In 751, Pepin was anointed by papal representatives, symbolizing a new alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the Church. This sacred endorsement bestowed upon the Carolingians not just political legitimacy, but divine sanction, a powerful combination in a deeply religious age. Pepin's son, Charlemagne Carolus Magnus, or Charles the Great, would become one of the most iconic figures of the medieval era. His reign, which lasted from 768 to 814, witnessed the expansion of the Frankish kingdom into a vast empire that encompassed much of Western and Central Europe. Through a series of campaigns, Charlemagne subdued the Lombards in Italy, the Saxons in Germania, and the Avars in the east, but Charlemagne's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. He fostered what would later be called the Carolingian Renaissance, revival of learning, literacy, and classical knowledge. Recognizing the importance of education in uniting his diverse empire, he established schools in monasteries and cathedrals, promoted Latin literacy, and encouraged the standardization of Christian worship and script. At the center of this intellectual revival was the palace school at Aachen, where scholars like Alcuin of York gathered to teach grammar, rhetoric, and theology. Under their guidance, scribes developed the Carolingian minuscule, a clear and legible script that would become the foundation of modern European writing. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in St. Peter's Basilica. This act symbolically revived the Western Roman Empire, centuries after its fall. Though Charlemagne himself may not have fully understood the implications, The coronation linked the authority of the Frankish ruler with the ancient prestige of Rome and the spiritual authority of the papacy. The Carolingian Empire was not a centralized state in the modern sense. Instead, it was a collection of territories governed by local counts and nobles, bound to the emperor through oaths of loyalty. Charlemagne sent royal agents, known as missi dominici, to oversee these regions and ensure justice and fidelity. The system was fragile, relying heavily on personal loyalty and the emperor's charisma. After Charlemagne's death, his empire began to unravel. His son, Louis the Pious, struggled to maintain unity, and upon Louis's death, the empire was divided among his sons. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 split the Carolingian lands into three parts, what would become the foundations of modern France, Germany, and Italy. These divisions, though political in nature, reflected deep linguistic and cultural differences, already taking shape. Despite the fragmentation, Charlemagne's legacy endured. The idea of a unified Christian Europe, governed by an emperor and guided by the Church, would echo through the Middle Ages. His reign became a model for future rulers, and his image shaped as much by legend as by history would be invoked by emperors, popes, and poets for centuries. While the empire he built could not withstand the test of time, the institutions he fostered, monastic schools, administrative systems, and ecclesiastical unity, formed the backbone of medieval society. And in the minds of many, the Carolingian world represented a golden age, a time when faith, learning, and order briefly flourished in the midst of a turbulent and uncertain world. Asterisk, with the fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire, Europe entered a new phase, one marked not by imperial unity, but by local power, personal bonds, and a profound transformation in how society was organized. This was the age of feudalism, a system that would define medieval life across the continent for centuries to come. Feudalism was not born from deliberate design. Rather, it evolved organically in response to insecurity, decentralization, and the need for mutual protection. In a world where centralized authority had weakened, and external threats loomed large, from Viking raids to Magyar incursions and Saracen attacks, people turned to local lords for security. At the heart of feudalism lay a simple but powerful concept: land in exchange for loyalty. The king, or in many cases a powerful noble, granted parcels of land fiefs to his vassals. In return, the vassals pledged military service, counsel, and loyalty. These vassals might then grant portions of their own lands to lesser vassals, creating a complex web of relationships that bound much of Europe in a network of mutual obligation. The oaths taken between lords and vassals were deeply symbolic. Ceremonies often involved the clasping of hands, the kiss of peace, and the swearing of fealty before sacred relics or altars. These rituals were not merely formalities. They reinforced the religious and moral weight of the bond, intertwining secular and spiritual duties. Parallel to this political structure was the economic reality of manorialism. The manor, typically a village, the surrounding farmland, and a lord's estate, was the basic unit of rural life. While feudalism governed the relationships between nobles, manorialism governed the lives of peasants. The majority of people in medieval Europe were peasants, and most of them were serfs bound to the land and obligated to serve their lord. They farmed the fields, maintained roads and buildings, and gave a portion of their harvest to the manor in the form of rent or tax. In exchange, they received protection, access to common land, and the right to cultivate certain plots for their own sustenance. A typical manor was largely fields were rotated using the three-field system, with 1/3 left fallow to recover its fertility. There were usually meadows for grazing animals, woods for firewood, a church at the center of spiritual life, and a mill to grind grain. Local blacksmiths, weavers, and carpenters ensured that basic needs were met without relying on distant trade. The daily life of a serf was one of rhythm and routine. Days began at dawn and ended with dusk. Tasks were dictated by the season. In spring, harvesting; in late summer, slaughtering animals; in autumn, and repairing tools during the long, cold winter months. Despite the hardship, village life had its communal joys, feast days, marriages, and the ever-present cycle of the liturgical year. Above the serfs lived the noble class. Lords, knights, and minor barons occupied castles or fortified manor houses, symbols of their military and social superiority. Their primary role was to fight and defend their lands. In return for their status, They were expected to lead troops in times of war and uphold justice within their domains. Knighthood itself was both a military function and a cultural ideal. Young noble boys were trained from an early age as pages and squires before undergoing the ceremony of knighting. The ideal knight was not just a skilled warrior, but a paragon of chivalry, a code of conduct that emphasized loyalty, honor, courtesy, and the protection of the weak, especially women and the church. Though often more aspirational than real, chivalric ideals helped shape the literature and imagination of the Middle Ages. Feudalism and manorialism were not static systems. They varied across regions, and they evolved over time. But together, they provided structure in a fractured world. They created a hierarchy where everyone had a place: king, noble, knight, priest, peasant, and everyone owed something to someone else. This intricate lattice of loyalty and land defined the political and social order for generations. While it could be oppressive and unjust, it also offered stability and a sense of belonging. In an age of uncertainty, the manor and the feudal oath were firm anchors in the flow of medieval life. In the tapestry of medieval life, no thread was more vibrant or enduring than that of the church. It wove through every aspect of existence, from the rhythms of daily labor to the mysteries of death and the hopes of the afterlife. During the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church was not merely a religious institution, it was a political power, a landholder, a patron of the arts, and the guardian of knowledge. At the top of this vast spiritual hierarchy stood the Pope, believed to be the successor of St. Peter and the vicar of Christ on earth. From his seat in Rome, the Pope exercised both spiritual and, at times, temporal authority over Christendom. His decrees could anoint kings or excommunicate them. His emissaries, bishops, archbishops, and legates spread his influence across the far reaches of Europe. Beneath the Pope, the Church's structure mirrored the feudal world around it. Bishops ruled over dioceses, often holding lands and titles. Like their secular counterparts, parish priests served local communities, tending not only to spiritual needs, but also to practical concerns. They baptized the newborn, married the faithful, and heard confessions in candlelit chapels, their Latin chants echoing through stone walls. But the soul of medieval spirituality was not found solely in cathedrals or papal palaces. It thrived in the quiet sanctity of monasteries. The monastic movement, which began in the deserts of Egypt and Syria centuries earlier, took deep root in medieval Europe. Inspired by the example of Saint Benedict of Nursia, many religious communities followed the rule of Saint Benedict, a guide to monastic life that emphasized obedience, stability, and ora et labora, prayer and work. Monasteries were places of devotion where monks lived apart from the world in pursuit of spiritual perfection. Within high stone walls, they followed a strict schedule marked by the tolling of bells. The day began before sunrise with matins, followed by a series of prayers, psalms, and readings throughout the day. When not praying, monks worked manuscripts, brewing ale, growing herbs, or tending sheep. Their labor was seen as an offering to God, their silence a testament to humility. The scriptorium, a room dedicated to copying texts, was a sanctuary of preservation. There, in the soft light of oil lamps, scribes hunched over wooden desks, carefully copying ancient manuscripts by hand. Thanks to their painstaking work, much of the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome survived the turbulence of the early medieval centuries. In the forests and remote valleys of Europe, monastic orders like the Benedictines, Cluniacs, and later the Cistercians built communities that not only nurtured spiritual life, but also cultivated land, administered justice, and provided hospitality to travelers. Pilgrims, nobles, and even kings sought their guidance and gave them gifts of land and treasure. Religious life extended beyond monasteries. The pilgrimage became a powerful expression of devotion. Thousands of faithful set out on long, arduous journeys to sacred sites: Santiago de Compostela in Spain, the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury, or, for the most fortunate, the distant lands of Jerusalem. Along the way, they stayed at inns run by monks, prayed at roadside chapels, and collected badges or tokens to mark their journey. Meanwhile, cathedrals began to rise across Europe, soaring testaments to divine glory. Built over generations, these architectural marvels blended engineering, art, and faith. Towering spires reached toward heaven. Stained glass windows bathed the interior in colored light, depicting scenes from scripture and the lives of saints. Gargoyles adorned the roofs, while choirs filled the nave with Gregorian chant. For many, the cathedral was a glimpse of the heavenly city itself. But the church was not without contradiction. While preaching humility, some clerics lived in wealth. While offering comfort to the poor, others were entangled in the ambitions of kings. Reform movements periodically arose, calling for purity, chastity, and a return to the gospel's simplicity. Still, in an age where illness could strike without warning and life was often harsh, the church offered solace. It baptized the cradle, married the bride, and anointed the dying. It offered a path to salvation, a calendar filled with saints' days and feasts, and a vision of eternal life that transcended earthly sorrow. Through its sacraments, its monasteries, and its cathedrals, the church shaped the medieval world, not only in doctrine, but in stone, song, and silence. Far from the stone towers of kings and the vaulted cathedrals of bishops, the rhythm of medieval life unfolded in the fields, meadows, and woodlands of the countryside. This was the realm of the peasant, the villager, the shepherd, and the thatcher. For most people in the Middle Ages, daily life was intimately tied to the land, shaped by the seasons, and governed by customs passed down from generation to generation. The village stood at the heart of rural life. It was often no more than a cluster of wooden cottages with thatched roofs, arranged around a church, a green, or a manor house. The houses were simple wattle and daub walls, small windows, earthen floors, and open hearths where meals were cooked in pots suspended over the flames. Smoke drifted upward to the rafters, and children played on the hard-packed dirt outside. Life was structured by the manorial system, a cornerstone of medieval society. Each manor was a self-sufficient estate, ruled by a local lord or noble. The land was divided into strips, with fields rotated between crops and fallow. Peasants, known as serfs, were bound to the land. They could not leave without the lord's permission, but in return they received protection and access to farmland. Work was hard, unending, and dictated by the seasons. In spring, fields were plowed and seeds sown. In summer, weeds were pulled, and animals herded. Autumn brought the harvest wheat, rye, barley, and was followed by threshing and storing. Winter was a time of repair, of weaving and mending, of quiet endurance. The tools of the farmer were simple: wooden plows, iron-tipped hoes, flails for threshing. Oxen pulled the plow, and sickles were used to cut grain by hand. Horses were prized, but expensive, and often reserved for wealthier tenants or knights. Watermills ground flour, and windmills, a later innovation, harnessed the breeze to lighten labor. Diet was plain and predictable. Bread was the staple dark, and coarse for the poor, finer for the rich. Alongside it came pottage, a stew of grains, and vegetables. Meat was rare for most villagers, though sometimes a pig was slaughtered or a rabbit caught in a snare. Cheese, onions, leeks, and cabbage filled the pot. Ale was safer than water and drunk with most meals. Clothing was homespun. Wool was sheared from sheep, spun into thread, and woven on looms. Dyeing was done with natural colors: browns, yellows, muted reds. Men wore tunics and hose. Women wore long dresses and head coverings. Shoes, if worn, were leather, handmade, and simple. Despite the hardships, the village was not without joy. Festivals punctuated the year: the Feast of St. John with its summer fires, harvest celebrations, and the revelry of Christmas and Easter. On these days there were dances on the green, music from lutes and flutes, and laughter around shared meals. Children were put to work early, gathering firewood, scaring birds from crops, or helping with weaving. But they also played games with balls or sticks, leapfrog, and storytelling by the hearth. Education was rare. Most villagers could not read or write, but wisdom was handed down orally, through proverbs, songs, and the steady example of elders. Life was deeply spiritual. The church calendar dictated not only holy days, but also fasts and feasts. The village priest was a central figure, offering sermons in Latin, tending to the sick, and reminding all of their place in the divine order. Bells rang out the hours of prayer, and crosses marked the fields as reminders of faith. Beyond the village lay the commons, meadows, forests, and rivers shared by all. Here, peasants grazed livestock, gathered firewood, and fished in still waters. The woods were rich with herbs, berries, and mushrooms, but also filled with wolves and wild boars. Legends and fears clung to shadowy glens, and tales of spirits and saints were told by flickering firelight, though their world was small. Medieval villagers lived in a delicate balance with nature and one another. Their toil sustained kingdoms, their hands built cathedrals, and their prayers rose like smoke into the vast star-filled sky. As the medieval centuries moved forward, life began to shift. The forests thinned, the roads grew busier, and across Europe, a quiet but powerful transformation took place. The growth of towns. In the early Middle Ages, Europe had been largely rural. Cities of antiquity had dwindled into ruins, their great forums and aqueducts left to crumble. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, change stirred. Old Roman roads were cleared, bridges rebuilt. Trade resumed slowly, hesitantly, and then with growing confidence. At first, the towns were little more than fortified marketplaces, places where local peasants might bring their grain or wool to barter. But over time, they became more than that. They became hubs of activity, of production, of aspiration. Merchants set up permanent stalls. Artisans opened workshops. Walls rose to protect the growing population, and with them came charters, privileges, and a new kind of independence. The town was different from the manor. Here, people were not bound by feudal ties but by contracts, by skills, and by coin. A new class emerged, the burghers, or bourgeoisie townspeople, who lived not by farming the land but by trade and craft. They formed guilds, powerful associations, of bakers, blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, and more. These guilds regulated prices, trained apprentices, and protected their members from outside competition. Inside the walls, the streets were narrow and often muddy. Houses were built of timber and crowded close together, their upper stories leaning over the road. The air was filled with the smells of baking bread, tanned leather, and ironwork, but also refuse, dung, and the pungent scent of tallow candles. Towns were noisy, vibrant, sometimes dangerous, and always alive. Markets were held weekly, fairs annually. People gathered from surrounding villages to buy, to sell, to hear news, to see entertainers or jugglers. Coins clinked, bargains were struck. Foreign traders arrived with exotic ware, spices from the east, fine silks, or salt from the coast. The towns grew wealthy, and with wealth came ambition. Towns often negotiated special rights from local lords or kings. These charters allowed them to govern themselves, collect taxes, and even raise militia. A new kind of identity formed, not as vassals, but as citizens. Walls marked this boundary clearly. Inside, order, commerce, community. Outside, the unpredictable countryside. As commerce expanded, so too did the range of goods and services. Banks appeared, lending money to merchants for long-distance journeys. Letters of credit made it possible to travel great distances without carrying large sums of cash. And ships left harbors from Venice, Genoa, and Bruges, their holds filled with textiles, timber, and olive oil. With the rise of towns came tension with the old feudal order. Nobles viewed the merchant class with suspicion. The church questioned their pursuit of profit, but the townspeople were persistent, and their influence grew. They funded cathedrals, sponsored universities, and even financed kings. Towns also became centers of learning. Cathedral schools expanded, drawing scholars and students. Latin remained the language of study, but increasingly, ideas began to flow. In the vernacular, legal codes were copied, medical texts translated, and merchants, in their travels, brought stories and knowledge from distant lands. In the larger towns, hospitals, almshouses, and orphanages appeared dirty expressions of civic responsibility. Bell towers rang out the hours, watchmen patrolled the streets, town criers shouted proclamations. Life here moved to a different rhythm than the fields. But towns were not without hardship. Fires were common. Disease spread quickly in the close quarters. The poor lived in cramped conditions, and beggars crowded the churches. Yet for many, the town offered opportunity, a place to rise by talent or trade, to learn a craft, or to see the world beyond the village. By the end of the High Middle Ages, towns were no longer exceptions. They were the engines of economic and cultural change, and though they did not yet challenge the castles or cathedrals in grandeur, they hinted at a future where the power of cities would one day rival that of kings. As the 11th century waned and the 12th century dawned, a great wave of fervor swept through Western Europe. It began with a sermon spoken in a distant French field by Pope Urban II in 1095. he called upon the knights and nobles of Christendom to take up the cross, to liberate the Holy Land, and to defend fellow Christians in the East. What followed was not just a military campaign, but a century-spanning chapter in medieval life, the Crusades. The First Crusade, filled with a mixture of religious zeal, ambition, and adventure, set forth toward Jerusalem. Thousands marched, some with armor and horses, others barefoot and untrained. They crossed rivers, mountains, and hostile lands. Many died on the way of hunger, of disease, or in skirmishes. But in 1099, those who survived reached Jerusalem and captured the city in a siege that turned brutal and bloody. The impact of this crusade rippled through Europe. A Crusader kingdom was established in the Levant, holding territories like Antioch and Tripoli. Pilgrims flowed eastward under the protection of sword-bearing knights. Castles were built on foreign soil, yet these gains were always fragile, surrounded by Muslim forces and dependent on supplies from across the sea. In time, more crusades followed. The Second Crusade ended in failure. The Third, led by famous figures such as Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, became legend. The Fourth Crusade, however, turned away from the Holy Land and instead sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, fracturing the fragile trust between the Latin West and the Greek East. The Crusades were not only about Jerusalem. Campaigns were launched in Spain to retake land from Muslim rulers. This long struggle became known as the Reconquista. Other crusades took place in the Baltic, targeting pagan peoples in the north. There were even crusades within Europe itself, against heretical movements and local dissenters. The motivations were complex. For some, it was a sacred duty, an act of penitence and piety. For others, it promised land, wealth, or the hope of salvation. The Church offered indulgences, spiritual rewards that erased sins for those who joined. Nobles saw an opportunity for glory. Younger sons, with no inheritance to claim, sought fortune and purpose in distant lands. The movement brought East and West into closer contact. Though often hostile, these encounters facilitated the exchange of goods, knowledge, and ideas. Crusaders returned with spices, fabrics, new crops, and medical knowledge. Arabic numerals, classical texts preserved by Muslim scholars, and instruments like the astrolabe found their way into Europe. But the human cost was high. Cities were burned, populations displaced. The Holy Land became a landscape of shifting borders and endless conflict. Relations between Christians, Muslims, and Jews were marked by violence and suspicion. In the towns of Europe, the Crusades were both a source of inspiration and fear. Preachers stirred crowds with fiery sermons. Monasteries chronicled the events. In illuminated manuscripts, Templars and Hospitallers, military monastic orders, rose to prominence, owning lands and commanding armies. Yet, in the end, most of the Crusader states were lost. Jerusalem fell again, and those small Christian enclaves remained for a time. They were eventually absorbed. By the late 13th century, the great crusading age was coming to an end. Still, the legacy lingered. The memory of crusades shaped Christian identity. The routes established by crusaders became paths for merchants and pilgrims. And in the cultural imagination, the idea of a holy war left deep impressions, both inspiring and troubling. The Middle Ages were marked by contradiction. Deep faith coexisted with ambition. Piety walked beside violence. And in the great movement of people across continents, the medieval world, once so insular, opened if only slightly to the wider globe. Beyond the castles, cathedrals, and crusades, there existed a quieter, slower rhythm, the heartbeat of medieval life. It echoed in the fields, in the thatched cottages, and in the soft tread of feet on earthen paths. This was the life of the peasantry, who made up the vast majority of the population during the Middle Ages. Most people lived in small rural communities, scattered across the countryside of Europe. These were villages and hamlets, often centered around a church and surrounded by open fields, woods, and rivers. At the center stood the manor house, or the lord's estate, a modest seat of authority compared to the grandeur of cities and courts, but important nonetheless. The manor was the basic unit of rural organization. It was both an economic engine and a social structure. The lord owned the land, and the peasants, known as serfs or villeins, worked it. In return for protection and the right to cultivate plots for themselves, they owed labor and a portion of their harvest. The obligations were detailed, even intricate. So many days plowing the lord's fields, so many baskets of grain, so many chickens owed at harvest time. Life followed the seasons. In spring, the plough carved furrows into the soil, and seeds were sown by hand. Summer brought long days of weeding and tending crops. Autumn was the busiest time, as the harvest had to be gathered before the weather turned. Winter was a quieter season, yet still filled with labor-mending tools, tending animals, spinning wool, and preparing for the lean months ahead. The medieval village was a close-knit world. Cottages with simple wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, dirt floors, hearth fires burned steadily. Furniture was scarce but functional. A wooden table, stools, perhaps a single bed shared by the family. Windows, if they existed, were small and often covered with cloth or oiled parchment. Peasant families kept animals, chickens, pigs, perhaps a cow or a few sheep. These were valuable sources of milk, meat, and manure. Fields were farmed in rotation, using the three-field system, one for spring crops, one for autumn crops, and one left fallow to recover. This method helped maintain soil fertility and improve yields, though their lives were hard. Peasants had customs, rituals, and celebrations that brought joy. Feast days were eagerly awaited, times when work paused and the village came together. May Day brought dancing and greenery. Harvest festivals marked the end of toil with music and shared food. The church calendar provided a rhythm of holy days and fasts, of saints' feasts and sacred processions. Religion was deeply woven into everyday life. The village church stood at the heart of the community. It was where children were baptized, couples married, and the dead laid to rest. Priests preached in Latin, but villagers understood the sacred through images, relics, and rituals. The ringing of the church bell marked the hours and echoed across the fields. Education was rare. Most peasants could not read or write, though they possessed a rich oral culture: songs, stories, proverbs passed from generation to generation. Knowledge of farming, of weather, of herbal remedies, and local lore was deep and instinctive. The bond between lord and peasant was formalized in the feudal contract, but shaped by daily realities. A just lord could earn the respect of his people. A cruel one might drive them to despair. Some peasants fled harsh lords, seeking freedom in towns or on lands where the law could not easily reach. In certain cases, if a serf managed to live a year and a day in a town without being claimed, they gained their freedom. Despite their hardships, peasants were not without dignity or resilience. Their hands sowed the seeds that fed nations. Their labor built the wealth that sustained kings and bishops. And while they may not have left behind grand monuments, their lives were the foundation upon which medieval society rested. In the fields and the furrows, in the tolling of the bell and the flicker of firelight, the medieval countryside hummed with quiet perseverance. It was not a life of ease, but it was a life of meaning, rooted in the land, shaped by the seasons, and anchored by the rhythms of tradition. Asterisk, while much of medieval life was grounded in manual labor and tradition, there were places where thought, study, and spiritual contemplation flourished. These sanctuaries of learning were monasteries, cathedral schools, and, in time, universities. Here, amid candlelit cloisters and stone lecture halls, the medieval mind reached outward toward understanding, preservation, and wonder. At the heart of medieval intellectual life stood the monastery. From the early Middle Ages onward, monastic communities preserved not only religious devotion, but also the written knowledge of the ancient world. Monks rose early, prayed in Latin, and followed a strict daily rhythm: ora, et labora, or pray and work. In addition to farming, brewing, and caring for the sick, monks labored in scriptoria, quiet rooms where books were copied by hand. Here, scribes bent over parchment, quills in hand, carefully transcribing sacred texts, commentaries, histories, and classical works. It was painstaking labor. A single Bible could take years to complete. Mistakes were scraped away with a knife. Decorated initials were painted in vivid blues and golds. Illuminated manuscripts emerged as treasures books, not just of content, but of beauty. The libraries of monasteries were modest in number, but rich in value. Works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Virgil survived thanks to generations of careful copying. Theology dominated, but natural science, grammar, logic, and astronomy had their place. In their quiet, secluded world, monks became the guardians of Western knowledge. As time passed, cathedral schools developed to educate clergy and select laymen. These schools, often associated with major churches, offered instruction in the trivium and quadrivium, the 7 liberal arts. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, trained the mind in language and reasoning. The quadrivium, geometry, music, and astronomy, explored number, form, harmony, and the heavens. By the 12th century, a new institution emerged, the university. The University of Bologna specialized in law, Paris excelled in theology, Oxford and Cambridge would soon follow. These universities were not buildings at first, but communities. Students and masters gathered for the pursuit of learning. Latin was the universal language of scholarship, allowing ideas to cross borders. Students came from all over Europe, sometimes walking for weeks or months to reach their destination. A university education was rigorous and long. Lectures were given aloud, with students taking notes or memorizing what they heard. Disputations, formal debates, tested understanding. A bachelor's degree might take several years, a master's degree even more. The doctorate, especially in law, theology, or medicine, could take decades. Scholars such as Thomas Aquinas sought to reconcile faith with reason, theology with philosophy. He and others revived the works of Aristotle, brought to Europe through contact with the Islamic world. Ideas flowed not only from ancient Greece and Rome, but from Arabic and Jewish scholars. Avicenna. The intellectual world of the Middle Ages was more interconnected than often assumed. The life of the medieval scholar was not luxurious. Lodgings were modest, heat was scarce, books were rare, but the pursuit of knowledge was sacred. In lecture halls, libraries, and quiet chapels, men and, in rare cases, women explored the mysteries of the divine, the order of the cosmos, and the structure of language and law. Women, too, found space for learning, especially in convents. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen combined mysticism, music, natural science, and theology. Her writings and compositions reveal a mind both devout and curious. Though excluded from the universities, some women carved out intellectual lives in the spaces available to them. That medieval education was not democratic, nor was it widespread. Most people remained illiterate. Yet the seeds planted in monasteries and universities would blossom in the centuries to come, fueling the Renaissance, shaping science, and forming the foundation of modern academia. And through it all, the quiet work continued, the monk copying by candlelight, the student poring over parchment, the teacher expounding Aristotle beneath a vaulted stone ceiling. In their dedication to thought, they offered a quiet resistance to the darkness, the light of knowledge for future generations. Amid the shifting political tides and spiritual devotion of the Middle Ages, there stood another defining element of the period, the castle. These massive stone structures, both defensive and symbolic, rose over the landscape like silent sentinels. More than just military bastions, castles were the homes of the nobility, the aristocratic class that ruled over land, labor, and law. In the early medieval period, fortifications were often made of wood. Matanbaili castles, with their timber towers perched on artificial hills, were quick to construct and easy to defend. Yet wood was vulnerable to fire and decay. As the centuries progressed, stone replaced timber. Great keeps with thick walls, arrow slits, and moats became common from the 11th century onward. A castle was more than a fortress. It was a seat of power. Within its walls lived the lord, his family, his knights, and numerous servants and retainers. The great hall served as a place for feasts, proclamations, and judgment. The solar offered privacy. Kitchens, stables, chapels, and armories all clustered within the curtain walls, creating a miniature society. Life in a castle was busy and highly structured. While lords managed land and led in war, ladies of the castle held great responsibility as well, supervising servants, managing supplies, and often defending the keep in times of siege. Pages and squires trained in arms and etiquette, hoping, one day, to become knights. And knighthood itself was no small matter. The medieval knight was more than a warrior. He was an ideal part of a chivalric code that prized honor, loyalty, and courage. Though the reality often fell short, the concept of chivalry became a powerful cultural force. Knights were expected to defend the weak, serve their lords faithfully, and conduct themselves with dignity and restraint. The rituals of knighthood were steeped in symbolism. A young man trained from childhood, learning the arts of horsemanship, swordplay, and heraldry. At a knighting ceremony, he might spend the night in prayer, don symbolic garments, and receive the blow that made him a knight, a tap on the shoulder with a sword. A rite both solemn and public. Tournaments offered a display of knightly prowess, mock battles, jousts, and pageantry that drew large crowds. These events allowed knights to prove themselves, forge alliances, and win favor. At times, they became dangerous and chaotic, but they remained a vital part of aristocratic life. Nobles held land granted by kings in return for service, forming the backbone of feudal society. Their wealth came from estates worked by peasants and serfs who owed labor, crops, and dues in exchange for protection. Lords held courts, levied taxes, and administered justice. They were powerful figures, but their position was not without peril. Feuds, shifting loyalties, and the dangers of war were constant threats. The noble household was a place of formality, ritual, and hierarchy. Meals were occasions for display, with elaborate dishes served on feast days and music filling the hall. Hunting was a favored pastime, a symbol of status and a means of maintaining martial skills. Falconry, too, was a noble pursuit. Training birds of prey to hunt was both sport and spectacle. Yet for all their privilege, nobles were also bound by oaths, customs, and expectations. Their lives were dictated by land, lineage, and loyalty. Marriages were often political, arranged to cement alliances or secure estates. Children were betrothed at a young age. Bloodlines, coats of arms, and heraldic symbols told stories of ancestry and honor. Chroniclers, minstrels, and poets elevated the deeds of nobles into legend. The Matter of Britain, the tales of King Arthur and his knights, captured ideals of bravery and sacrifice. The chansons de geste, such as the Song of Roland, celebrated heroic loyalty unto death. These stories were not only entertainment, shaped the very self-image of the aristocracy. Despite the glamour often associated with the medieval nobility, their lives were also filled with tension, conflict, and uncertainty. The balance of power was delicate. A lord could rise through valor or fall through a whisper of treason. Behind every castle wall lay a story of ambition, duty, and the fragile illusion of permanence. And so, from the battlements of distant strongholds to the pages of illuminated manuscripts, the world of castles and chivalry offered a vision of the Middle Ages that endures in imagination. A world of banners fluttering in the wind, of armored riders on horseback, of solemn vows and shining swords, all resting atop a foundation of land, labor, and legacy. Asterisk, while kings ruled from palaces and peasants toiled in fields, another transformation was quietly unfolding across the medieval landscape, one driven by markets, merchants, and money. The Middle Ages, often associated with castles and cathedrals, were also a time of economic revival. Slowly but surely, Europe began to stir with commercial activity, and the foundations of a new economic order were laid in the narrow streets of growing towns. In the early medieval centuries, trade was sparse and local. Most people lived and died within a short distance of their birthplace, relying on subsistence farming and the goodwill of their immediate community. Roads were poor, travel was perilous, and coinage was limited. Barter was common. Yet over time, the conditions began to shift. Several factors contributed to this gradual awakening. First was the relative stabilization of Europe after the worst waves of invasions subsided. Viking, Magyar, and Saracen raids diminished, and the climate during a period sometimes referred to as the medieval warm period became more favorable to agriculture. As surplus grew, so did the need for exchange. Monasteries and manor houses became centers of production and trade, producing goods not only for survival but for profit. A surplus of grain or wool might be sold in a local market, and from there carried to nearby towns by traveling merchants. These traders, often seen as outsiders at first, began to form a class of their own enterprising individuals who dealt not in land or lineage, but in goods and coin. The rebirth of towns was both a cause and a consequence of this economic revival. Across Europe, old Roman cities were repopulated, and new urban centers emerged near crossroads, rivers, and castles. Markets were granted charters by kings or lords, often with rights to hold weekly fairs. In time, these towns developed walls, councils, and privileges, forming the basis of what would become the urban middle class. Life in a medieval town was noisy, crowded, and vibrant. Cobblestone streets bustled with activity. Artisans set up workshops in their homes, shoemakers, blacksmiths, bakers, and weavers Guilds formed to regulate quality, protect their trades, and train apprentices. The Guildhall became both a center of business and a mark of pride. Markets were the heart of urban life. Traders sold spices, cloth, iron tools, salted fish, and fine ceramics. The smells of livestock, fresh bread, and dye vats mingled in the air. Language too was diverse, especially in great trading cities like Venice, Genoa, or Bruges, where merchants from distant lands came together under banners and tents. The Mediterranean played a central role in this economic web. Italian city-states such as Venice and Pisa grew wealthy through trade with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Ships brought silk, sugar, and spices from the East, luxuries that fetched high prices in northern markets. In return, European merchants offered wool, timber, and metals. Trade fairs, especially in regions like Champagne in France, became major events. Merchants traveled for weeks, gathering in open fields or temporary structures to exchange goods and coin. These fairs helped standardize weights and measures, spread financial innovations, and foster trust across cultures. Over time, money changers and lenders also took their place in the scene, giving rise to the early forms of banking. With economic growth came a slow erosion of the rigid feudal order. Serfs sometimes bought their freedom. Towns received liberties that exempted them from traditional obligations. In the phrase, "Stadtluft matched frei city air makes you free," there lay a truth. Urban life offered opportunities that rural life could not. Still, towns were not free from danger or hardship. Fires were common, as were outbreaks of disease. Sanitation was poor. Crime and corruption found fertile ground. Yet the benefits of urban life were significant. Schools, universities, and printing presses would later thrive in these dense environments. Literacy, and innovation followed in their wake. The medieval economy was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual transformation, a long awakening from centuries of contraction. Bit by bit, coin replaced barter, craft replaced self-sufficiency, and cities emerged as the heartbeat of a more connected Europe. It was in these towns and markets, behind the stalls of spice merchants and under the banners of proud guildsmen, that the seeds of capitalism and modern commerce first took root. Long before the industrial age or the modern corporation, the wheels of economic change were turning in the dusty streets of medieval Europe slowly, steadily, and with lasting effect. Among the most dramatic and far-reaching chapters of the Middle Ages were the Crusades, military expeditions launched under the banner of the Cross. They were conceived as holy wars, yet they became something far more complex, a series of campaigns involving religion, politics, trade, and shifting alliances. The Crusades opened east to west, brought cultures into contact and conflict, and reshaped the medieval world in ways few could have foreseen. The roots of the crusading movement lay in both faith and fear. By the late 11th century, Christian Europe had stabilized enough to look beyond its borders. At the same time, pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, faced growing obstacles as political control shifted among Muslim powers. News of difficulties faced by Eastern Christians reached the Pope in Rome, along with an appeal for help from the Byzantine Emperor. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont, France, and issued a call that would echo across Christendom. He urged knights and nobles to take up arms, journey eastward, and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. He offered not only spiritual rewards, absolution from sin, but the promise of purpose, adventure, and eternal glory. The response was overwhelming. The First Crusade was not a single army, but a collection of forces led by various European nobles. They marched across Europe and Anatolia, enduring hunger, disease, and skirmishes. In 1099, they reached Jerusalem, and after a brutal siege, captured the city. The conquest was marked by violence and bloodshed, events that would be remembered and resented for generations. The Crusaders established several states in the Levant: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These outposts of Latin Christianity were both fragile and fiercely defended. Over the decades, Muslim leaders began to regroup. Saladin, the formidable Sultan of Egypt and Syria, retook Jerusalem in 1187, prompting the launch of the Third Crusade, this time involving figures like Richard the Lionheart of England and Philip II of France. The Crusades continued in waves, each with its own motives and consequences. Some campaigns never reached the Holy Land. The Fourth Crusade, diverted by political and financial interests, ended in the sack of Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city plundered by fellow Christians. It was a bitter moment that deepened the rift between the Latin and Orthodox churches. Meanwhile, crusading zeal extended beyond the Mediterranean. Campaigns were launched against pagans in the Baltic, heretics in southern France, and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. These so-called crusades blended religious fervor with local ambitions. The Teutonic Knights, for example, established a military state in Prussia while fighting non-Christian peoples. In Spain, Christian kingdoms pushed southward in the gradually reclaiming territory from Muslim rulers. The effects of the Crusades were manifold. They fostered a sense of pan-European identity, as knights from diverse lands fought under a shared cause. They stimulated trade, especially in luxury goods like spices, silk, and glassware. Italian port cities Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew, wealthy by supplying crusader fleets and trading with the East. Cultural exchanges, too, were significant. Europeans encountered advanced medical knowledge, architecture, mathematics, and literature from the Islamic world. Though not always harmonious, these encounters sowed the seeds of future intellectual growth. Arabic texts on astronomy, philosophy, and medicine were translated into Latin, entering the libraries of European scholars. Yet the Crusades also deepened hostilities. Jewish communities in Europe suffered during crusading fervor, with massacres occurring in cities along the Rhine. In the East, the memory of Christian violence lingered long. The dream of a united Christendom under papal leadership never fully materialized. As the Middle Ages wore on, crusading spirit waned. The last Crusader stronghold in the Levant, Acre, fell in 1291. Yet the idea of holy war persisted, repurposed by kings and popes alike to suit new agendas. The Crusades had begun as pilgrimages with swords, but they ended as complex episodes of conquest, commerce, and cultural entanglement. And so, the Middle Ages pressed on, now shaped by the echoes of those who had marched under the cross not just in faith, but in search of power, profit, and a place in history. As the Middle Ages progressed, Europe began to transform not through war or religion alone, but through the quiet revolution of daily life. This change was most visible in the rise of towns and the gradual shift from a purely agrarian society to one in which commerce, craftsmanship, and urban life began to flourish. For much of the early Middle Ages, life had centered around the countryside. Manors and villages dotted the landscape, and the rhythms of life were tied to the fields. Towns existed, of course, but many had dwindled since the fall of the Roman Empire. Roads were poor, long-distance trade was limited, and the very idea of city life felt distant and rare. Yet from the 11th century onward, things began to shift. This change was driven in part by population growth. As Europe became more stable and secure, more people were born and they needed places to live, work, and trade. Slowly, small settlements near castles, monasteries, or crossroads began to expand. These were often referred to as burghs or boroughs, names that still survive in cities like Edinburgh or Pittsburgh. Over time, some became bustling centers of trade and life. Markets were central to this development. A village might have held a weekly market where farmers sold produce and goods, but towns could host much larger and more permanent gatherings. Fairs were held annually, drawing traders from across regions, sometimes even from distant lands. The Champagne fairs in northern France, for example, were renowned for bringing together merchants from Italy, Flanders, and beyond. In these growing towns, a new kind of citizen emerged, the burgher or bourgeois. These were neither peasants nor nobles, but something in between, a class of tradesmen, merchants, and craftsmen who made their living not from the land, but from their skills, goods, or shops. Over time, this merchant class would gain influence, wealth, and a voice in urban governance. To protect their interests and ensure quality, craftsmen began to form guilds. These were associations of people working in the same trade: carpenters, weavers, blacksmiths, bakers, and many more. Guilds regulated training, controlled prices, and set standards for workmanship. An apprentice would train under a master for years before becoming a journeyman, and eventually, if skilled enough, a master himself. Guilds were more than professional networks. They were communities. Members supported one another in times of illness or hardship. Guild halls became centers of social and civic life. Each guild had its own patron saint, celebrated on special feast days with processions and festivals. In this way, work and faith intertwined in the life of the medieval craftsman. Meanwhile, the merchant class grew ever more ambitious. They traveled far to acquire good spices from the east, wool from England, wine from France, furs from the Baltic. They learned to navigate complex networks of currency, exchange, credit, and risk. Some formed powerful merchant leagues, like the Hanseatic League, a commercial alliance of cities along the North and Baltic seas that protected trade and mutual interests. As towns gained wealth, they also sought independence. Many negotiated charters from local lords or kings, granting them rights of self-governance, the ability to hold courts, and exemption from certain feudal duties. These chartered towns, known as communes in some regions, became early centers of civic pride and local identity. Urban life was not without its difficulties. Towns were often cramped, with narrow streets, open sewers, and poor sanitation. Fires were common, as homes were made of wood and built close together. Disease could spread rapidly, something that would become tragically important in later centuries. Yet despite these challenges, towns offered something rare in the medieval world: opportunity. In cities, a serf might escape the rigid bounds of feudal life. There was even a saying, "Stadtluft matched frei." City air makes you free, reflecting the idea that a runaway serf could become a free man after living in a town for a year and a day. While not universal, it captured the spirit of possibility that towns represented. And so, slowly but surely, the medieval town changed the fabric of European life. It fostered a middle class that would one day challenge both noble and clerical power. It encouraged education, innovation, and economic growth. In the quiet workshops and bustling markets of medieval cities, the seeds of modern society were being sown patiently, diligently, and almost invisibly. As towns and commerce grew, so too did a thirst for knowledge and learning. The Middle Ages, often seen as a time of darkness and ignorance, were in truth a period of remarkable intellectual development. This era, sometimes called the Scholastic Age, saw the foundation of the first universities and the gradual rediscovery of ancient knowledge. The word university comes from the Latin universitas, meaning a whole or corporation. These early universities were not sprawling campuses, like those today, but communities of teachers and students gathered in towns to study theology, law, medicine, and the arts. The University of Bologna, founded around 1088, is often considered the oldest, followed by the University of Paris and Oxford in the 12th and 13th centuries. Universities grew out of cathedral schools and monastic centers of learning. Monks and clerics had long preserved ancient manuscripts, copying them by hand in quiet scriptoriums. But now, as cities expanded, the demand for educated clergy, lawyers, and officials increased. Our teaching was based on the careful reading and debating of classical texts, works by Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, and Christian theology. Scholars engaged in dialectic reasoning, using questions and answers to explore difficult ideas. This method, known as scholasticism, sought to harmonize faith and reason. One towering figure of this period was Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar, whose writings integrated Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. His Summa Theologica remains one of the most influential works in Western thought. Universities were organized into faculties divisions of studies such as theology, law, medicine, and the arts, which included grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Students typically began with the trivium grammar, rhetoric, logic, before advancing to the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. Attendance was mostly male and often included young men from noble or wealthy families. Education was costly and required years of study. Still, universities were remarkably international. Students and teachers came from across Europe, speaking Latin, the common academic language. Degrees were awarded to certify knowledge and skills. The bachelor was an initial step, followed by the master or doctor in advanced fields. These degrees allowed graduates to teach or hold church and government positions. University life had its own rhythms and challenges. Students lived in rented rooms or halls, sometimes under strict regulations. Disputes could arise between townspeople and students, leading to conflicts and occasional riots. Yet, the pursuit of knowledge remained the focus. Libraries grew in importance. housing collections of manuscripts carefully copied by scribes. The art of illumination decorating texts with elaborate illustrations and gold leaf books were precious and rare, treasured by their owners. The scholastic age laid the intellectual foundations that would influence the Renaissance and beyond. It preserved and expanded knowledge, fostering a culture of inquiry and debate that quietly shaped the future. As the Middle Ages progressed, architecture took on new forms and meanings. The Gothic era, beginning in the 12th century, gave birth to soaring cathedrals that still inspire awe today. These massive stone structures were more than places of worship. They were monuments to faith, community, and human ingenuity. Gothic architecture is characterized by its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and large stained glass windows. These features allowed builders to create taller, lighter buildings that reached towards the heavens, filling interiors with colorful, filtered light. The first truly Gothic building is generally considered to be the Basilica of Saint Denis, near Paris. Its innovative use of flying buttresses enabled walls to be thinner and windows to be larger, flooding the interior with light, symbolizing divine presence. Cathedrals served many functions as centers of worship, pilgrimage destinations, marketplaces, and gathering places. They were often the tallest and most imposing structures in a town or city, a source of pride and identity for the community. Building a cathedral could take decades or even centuries, requiring vast resources and the work of countless artisans, masons, carpenters, and laborers. The process was slow and meticulous, with master builders passing down knowledge through generations. The stained glass windows told biblical stories and the lives of saints in vivid color, educating the largely illiterate population. The light streaming through these windows was seen as a metaphor for divine enlightenment. The cathedrals also housed elaborate sculptures depicting biblical scenes, grotesques, and figures of angels and demons. These served as visual sermons, reminders of moral lessons and spiritual truths. Famous examples include Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres Cathedral, and Canterbury Cathedral. Each has unique features but shares the grandeur and spiritual aspiration of the Gothic style. The construction of these cathedrals reflected the growing power of the Church during the High Middle Ages, as well as the wealth of cities and the devotion of their inhabitants. Through their beauty and scale, Gothic cathedrals continue to inspire wonder, inviting quiet reflection and a sense of connection to the past. As the 14th century unfolded, Europe faced one of the most devastating events in its history, the Black Death. This deadly pandemic swept across the continent, reshaping society in profound and lasting ways. The Black Death, caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, arrived in Europe around 1347, carried by fleas living on black rats that traveled with merchant ships. It spread rapidly through towns and countryside, leaving death and fear in its wake. Symptoms of the plague included fever, chills, swollen lymph nodes called buboes, and often a swift and painful death. It is estimated that the Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population in just a few years. The impact was staggering. Entire villages were wiped out, labor became scarce, and the social order was shaken. The shortage of workers gave peasants and laborers more bargaining power, leading to demands for better wages and conditions. The Church, which had been a central authority in medieval life, was challenged. Many clergy died, and faith was tested as prayers seemed to go unanswered. Some turned to religious fervor, others to superstition or blame. Sadly, sometimes directing violence against minority groups like Jews, accused unfairly of causing the plague. Economically, the Black Death disrupted trade and agriculture, but also led to innovation. Landowners began to convert fields from labor-intensive crops to pasture for sheep, supporting the growing wool trade. Culturally, the plague inspired new artistic themes. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, became popular, reminding people of the universality of death, regardless of status. Despite its horrors, the Black Death contributed to the transformation of medieval society. The decline in population helped break down feudal structures and pave the way for social and economic changes that would unfold in the centuries ahead. Following the turmoil of the Black Death, Europe soon entered another long and complex period of conflict known as the 100 Years' War. This war, lasting from 1337 to 1453, was primarily fought between the kingdoms of England and France. deeply shaping the medieval world. The roots of the war lay in disputed claims to the French throne and competing territorial ambitions. English kings, descended from the Norman conquerors, claimed parts of France as their own, while French monarchs sought to assert full control over their realm. The war was marked by famous battles, such as Crécy and Agincourt, where English forces, often smaller in number, used innovative tactics and longbows to great effect. These battles became legendary for their dramatic outcomes and military significance. The war also saw the rise of notable figures like Joan of Arc, a young peasant woman who inspired the French to renewed vigor. Claiming divine guidance, she played a crucial role in lifting the siege of Orleans and turning the tide in favor of France. Before her tragic capture and execution, the conflict was not continuous but consisted of periods of intense fighting interspersed with truces and negotiations. It devastated regions of France, causing widespread hardship for the civilian population. Beyond the battlefield, the war accelerated changes in warfare, society, and politics. The use of professional armies began to replace feudal levies, and the importance of knights declined as infantry and artillery became more prominent. National identity also started to take shape, with England and France emerging as distinct nations with strong centralized monarchies. The medieval ideal of chivalry evolved amid the realities of prolonged conflict. By 1453, the French had largely expelled the English from their territories, except for Calais, marking the end of the 100 Years' War. The conclusion of this war set the stage for the transition from the medieval period to the early modern era, during the later Middle Ages. Amidst war and hardship, a quiet but profound transformation took place. The rise of universities and a revival of learning that would shape the future of Europe. Universities began to form in the 12th and 13th centuries, growing out of cathedral schools and scholarly communities. Cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford became centers of education, where students and teachers gathered to study law, medicine, theology, and the arts. These early universities were organized into faculties, such as the Faculty of Arts, which was the starting point for many students before moving on to specialize. Lectures were delivered in Latin, the scholarly language of the time, and students often debated and discussed texts for hours. The curriculum was based on the trivium and quadrivium, foundational subjects that included grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This structured approach to knowledge encouraged critical thinking and intellectual exploration. Scholars such as Thomas Aquinas sought to reconcile faith and reason, drawing on the works of ancient philosophers like Aristotle, whose texts were rediscovered through contact with the Islamic world. This blending of Christian theology and classical philosophy created a rich intellectual tradition known as scholasticism. Universities also fostered a sense of community and identity among scholars, who sometimes clashed with local authorities over rights and privileges. Despite challenges, these institutions grew steadily in influence. The revival of learning at universities laid the groundwork for later developments, including the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution. It marked a turning point where knowledge began to expand beyond religious confines into broader realms of inquiry. This blossoming of education encouraged curiosity, innovation, and a deeper understanding of the world. Quiet changes that, like the slow growth of a tree, would eventually reshape European society. As the 15th century drew to a close, Europe stood on the threshold of profound change. The Middle Ages, with its castles, knights, and cathedrals, gradually gave way to the beginnings of the Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and culture. The Renaissance started in Italy, a land of ancient ruins and vibrant city-states like Florence, Venice, and Rome. Here, scholars and artists rediscovered the knowledge of classical Greece and Rome, studying ancient texts and exploring new ideas about humanity and the world. Artists such as Leonardo, Da Vinci, and Michelangelo created masterpieces that combined scientific observation with profound beauty. Writers like Dante and Petrarch explored human emotion and individual experience, shaping literature in new ways. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 was a turning point. Books could now be produced more quickly and cheaply, spreading knowledge far beyond the elite few who could afford hand-copied manuscripts. Politically, powerful monarchs began to centralize authority, and the feudal system declined. New trade routes expanded Europe's horizons, connecting it more closely with distant lands. Religious change also simmered beneath the surface, foreshadowing the Reformation that would challenge the Church's authority in the coming century. The Middle Ages, with all their complexity and change, had laid the foundations for the modern world. They were a time of castles and cathedrals, of plagues and wars, of faith and learning, a rich tapestry woven over centuries. Now, as you rest and listen, imagine the gentle turning of these centuries, the quiet progress of ideas, the steady march of history. Let your mind drift softly through the ages, peaceful and calm. Rest now, listener. If you liked this journey through time, please follow for more stories to help you drift to sleep.